What if I told you that the Vikings, the same men remembered for axes, raids, and blood-soaked sagas, carried a secret history of love that the world tried to silence? Beneath the crash of shields and the roar of longships, there were glances. In the firelight, oaths sworn with more than loyalty, poems that praised warriors with the language of desire, and graves where two men were buried side by side like husbands of the afterlife. Imagine Odin himself accused of practicing forbidden's magic, Loki transforming into a mother, warriors mocked with insults that only make sense if intimacy truly existed. This is not the story of kings and conquests you've already heard. It's the untold story of hidden love, of secret laughter, of tokens buried under mounds and verses disguised as praise. Tonight, you're not just listening to history, you're uncovering what it tried to hide. So stay with me, stay curious, and let's step together into the longhouse shadows, the storm-tossed ships, the quiet meadows, and the secret chambers of Viking hearts. Imagine for a moment the roaring fires of a Viking longhouse flickering against carved wooden beams, the sea's breath still lingering on the cloaks of warriors who had returned from faraway raids, and the quiet murmur of songs that spoke not only of conquest, but of love that history rarely mentions. Tonight we open a story that official chronicles often left hidden between the cracks. A story about desire, secrecy, devotion, and the unspoken connections that bound Viking men to one another in ways both intimate and defiant. You may have heard of the sagas of heroes, of blood spilled in icy fjords, of kings who carved their names into stones. But what about the tender glances shared between warriors in the dark of a hall, the whispered vows exchanged on sea voyages, when the world beyond the ship's deck was nothing but waves and stars? What about the men whose deepest loyalties were to one another, not only as brothers in arms, but as companions in body and heart? Tonight, we begin unraveling those hidden threads. And before we settle into the rhythm of the story, I want you to take a deep breath. Notice where you are right now. Maybe you're curled up under a blanket, the glow of your screen, the only light in the room. Perhaps outside your window rain is gently falling, or the city has grown quiet for the night. Let this stillness hold you while we travel back to a world where the north winds carried both the scent of pine forests and the unspoken truths of human longing. Before we dive deeper, I invite you to subscribe to our channel so you never miss these hidden histories told softly for your nights. And tell me, from where are you listening? Is it a quiet village, a bustling city, a desert night, or maybe even from the gentle hum of headphones as you drift toward sleep? We are all connected, here through curiosity, through the pulse of stories that refuse to remain silent. So come with me back to the age of the Vikings, where strength was measured in both steel and silence, and where even in the most feared of warriors, there flickered desires the world pretended not to see. The scene opens slowly, the great hall. At midnight, firelight dimming into embers, the smell of roasted meat still clinging to the air, and two figures lingering long after the others have gone. Their voices are hushed, but their laughter carries a warmth that no saga ever dared to write. What passes between them in those moments is not recorded in stone, but it is no less real. And it is there, in the gap between what is spoken and what is hidden, that our story begins. The fire cracks faintly as the hall empties further, and outside the heavy wooden doors, the night wind whistles across the fjord, carrying with it the cries of seabirds and the far-off echo of waves smashing against the cliffs. In these small hours, when the chatter of the feast has faded and the warriors' boasting songs are replaced by the rhythm of breath and slumber, something softer is allowed to emerge, though never openly spoken of. For the Vikings lived in a world where strength was a shield and silence was a sword. And yet beneath the noise of conquest, there were other stories, just as human, just as powerful, though less often told. You may imagine them as brutes of iron and fury, but even men who raided villages and bent the sea to their will had hearts that beat in secret patterns, longing for touch, for comfort, for bonds that could not always be explained in the language of their sagas. History tells us little, but archaeology whispers in its place. Runestones that bear cryptic carvings, burial sites where two men were interred together in ways that mirror husband and wife graves, and tales passed down through whispers in the sagas of men who mocked one another for being Argr, a word that hinted at effeminacy, or at least deviation from the expected norms of desire. But who decided what was shameful and what was sacred? Even now, the scholars argue. And as we lie here together in this quiet moment, you may feel the pull of curiosity. Were the Vikings truly rigid in their rules, or did the darkness of their halls hold more freedom than we imagine? Picture it, a pair of men rowing side by side, their muscles straining in unison under the endless sun of a northern summer, their laughter breaking the monotony of travel. Or think of the winter nights when men huddled together for warmth, their breaths visible in the frigid air, when closeness was survival, and survival bred tenderness. Perhaps one hand lingered too long, perhaps one gaze held too much, and in that pause something happened that sagas could not quite erase, though they tried. Tonight, we will let ourselves imagine, not as scandal, not as blasphemy, but as truth. That desire has always existed, even in the age of the Vikings, even in the hearts of men who carved dragons on their ships and sailed into the unknown. The longhouse, with its smoke-filled rafters and benches lined with weary bodies, was more than a place of feasting. It was a theater of glances, a place where bonds were forged in shadows as much as in daylight. Imagine sitting there, the warmth of another man's shoulder pressed against yours, the air thick with the smell of sweat, ale, and pine pitch, while your hands brush in the passing of a horn. For most, it was nothing, a moment unnoticed. But for some, it carried weight, a secret thrill, a pulse of recognition. And in those moments, centuries collapsed, because the language of longing is timeless. In some sagas, insults were hurled, sharp and dangerous, about men who played the woman's part. But what these accusations reveal, more than shame, is presence, the undeniable truth that such relationships existed, that they were seen and felt, even if condemned. You might wonder how these men carried their secrets across frozen seas, how they bore the weight of silence while standing shoulder to shoulder in battle. But consider this. Perhaps silence was their sanctuary too. Perhaps it was within that silence that they carved out a world of their own, invisible to the scribes, but as real as the northern lights arching over the sky. And so, as you rest, let the crackle of that imagined fire lull you. Let the whisper of the wind over the fjord remind you that history is never only what is written. It is also what is lived in the spaces between words, in the warmth of hands, held too long, in the eyes that met when no one else was watching. This is where our journey begins, and as the night deepens, we will walk further into the hidden chambers of Viking life, uncovering not only the love that dared not speak, but the humanity that binds us across the centuries. Close your eyes now, if you wish, and see the hall before you. Smell the pine smoke, hear the hush of laughter fading into silence, and know that behind the legends of steel and storm, there were softer stories still waiting to be told. Outside, the longhouse tonight had not fully surrendered to silence, for even in the stillness of a Viking village, there were sounds that whispered through the dark, the clink of harness as horses shifted restlessly in the frost, the soft creak of boats tugging at their moorings on the icy fjord, the sigh of the wind weaving through pine and birch. Inside, men lay sprawled in drunken slumber, the embers glowing low, shadows flickering like restless spirits against the carved dragon posts. And there, tucked between the cracks of history, were moments too fragile to ever be carved in stone. To understand the hidden story of same-sex love in Viking times, one must look not only at what the sagas declared, but at what they carefully avoided, for silence itself becomes a clue. The sagas loved insults, and the insult most feared by Viking men was to be called Argr or Urgi, words that meant something more slippery than cowardice, something that suggested softness, or stepping outside the rigid bounds of masculine power. The fact that such words were dangerous shows us what was unspoken. That desire between men was not absent, but present enough to need controlling. And yet, despite the saga's silence, archaeology has given us glimpses. A burial in Birka, Sweden, where a warrior long assumed to be male was found to be biologically female, yet buried with weapons and honored as a fighter. Another grave in Denmark, where two men were interred side by side, one with symbols of wealth and the other with symbols of companionship, as if bound in union beyond death. Scholars argue over these clues, some insisting that Viking society allowed more fluidity than later Christian scribes admitted, others insisting that these were anomalies. But in the hush of the midnight hall, such debates dissolve, and one can simply picture two men sitting apart from the drunken noise, speaking in low voices about the voyages they had endured together. Imagine them, rough hands scarred from oars and axes, hair braided loosely, eyes catching the firelight, a horn of mead passed back and forth between them. Their talk drifts from raids and storms into softer things, the feel of the sea under moonlight, the way loneliness gnaws on the bones in foreign lands, the strange comfort of another man's presence when the world feels too vast. A laugh escapes, softer than the clash of swords, and in that laugh is recognition, a rhythm older than laws, a rhythm that needs no witness but the heart. You may wonder, did the Vikings allow such bonds openly? Not quite. To be accused of being passive in love was shameful in their eyes, but to be admired for deep friendship, loyalty, and even physical closeness was not unusual. Men slept side by side in cold winters. They embraced after victory. They kissed, cheeks in greeting, and sometimes, perhaps, those gestures blurred into something more. Curiosity arises here. Did their gods judge them for it? Odin, the All-Father, was a god who knew shapeshifting, who took the forms of men and women, who drank from the wells of wisdom that erased boundaries. Loki, the trickster, was said to have given birth to a horse, shifting genders with ease. If the divine itself was fluid, could mortal men have felt condemned for following their own currents of desire? Perhaps the real silence of the sagas was not a denial, but a veil, protecting something too complex to be written. And so, when you picture Viking men, do not see only raiders and killers. See them also as human beings lying awake in the dark, listening to the breathing of the man beside them, aware that tomorrow's battle could steal him away, aware that tonight was the only eternity they had. Imagine the stormy nights on a ship where rain lashed against skin and men huddled beneath hides, shoulders pressed close, the sea tossing them like children. In those moments, survival was shared, and survival became intimacy, and intimacy became memory. Some of those memories were carried home across the waves, sealed tight like a secret chest never opened. Others slipped out in glances, in small touches, in songs too quiet for sagas to bother recording. And if you listen closely tonight, with your own eyes closing against sleep, you might hear it too, the rhythm of oars, the splash of water, the murmur of voices not in war but in closeness, voices speaking a truth that was never erased, only hidden. Because the story of love in Viking times is not one of absence but of presence, tucked away behind words like Argr, hidden in the folds of gods who shifted shapes, and carried in the bones of men who could not record their tenderness, but who lived it nonetheless. And as we drift further into this tale, know that the next layer will take us deeper still, into the laws, the punishments, the secret bargains made in midnight fields, and the way shame was used to police what could never truly be destroyed. Morning after a feast in a Viking settlement was always a quieter thing than the night before. And perhaps that is where our story of hidden love continues, not in the noise of horns and songs, but in the softened hush of recovery when men stirred. From benches with heavy heads, and women swept the floors with pine boughs to clear away the fragments of spilled meat and broken pottery. Imagine the pale northern sun creeping through smoke holes in the roof, striking dust that hung in the air like faint stars. And among those who stirred, 2 warriors moved more slowly than the rest, lingering at the edge of the hall where few eyes wandered. They had fought together the year before in Ireland, their hands blistered from ropes and their eyes filled with the memory of blood on wet grass. Yet here they were, alive still, drinking weak ale to ease their heads. One nudges the other, a small jest about the chieftain's endless boasting, and the other laughs in return. But there is something heavier carried in that laughter, a weight of recognition and gratitude that words could not shape. For you see, in Viking culture, bonds between men were exalted to the point of poetry. Brotherhood in arms was not only a phrase, it was survival, and the line between loyalty and longing was not always easy to mark. In the Sagas, insults about a man's bed often tried to wound his reputation, but hidden inside those insults was proof that such bedfellows existed. Otherwise the taunt would hold no power. Think of it. Why would a man fear being accused of lying with another man unless such things truly occurred? And so, the language itself becomes evidence, even as the sagas attempt to bury the truth beneath mockery. Archaeology, too, lends its whisper, for in the graves unearthed across Scandinavia, there are objects placed with care that suggest not only status, but companionship. In one grave, 2 swords are laid side by side, though only one body rests there. In another, jewelry more, often associated with women, rests beside the bones of a man, as if identity itself was less rigid than later storytellers claimed. Yet historians debate fiercely. Were these examples of love or simply misreadings? Still, to those who close their eyes and imagine, there is no difficulty picturing 2 men who, having survived the thunder of storms and the clash of steel, found comfort in each other's arms when the world beyond their hall felt too cold to bear. There is even a hint of this in Old Norse poetry, where men swore oaths of such intensity that the words bleed with intimacy. "I will not part from you," one vow reads, "until the earth crumbles beneath our feet." Is this not the language of lovers, even if disguised as comradeship? And here lies the strangeness. In a society where men could openly share beds, for warmth, could embrace after battle, could kiss in greetings without suspicion, where was the line drawn, and who drew it? Some scholars suggest that Viking notions of masculinity were less about who one lay with, and more about who held dominance. For to be accused of being passive was shameful, while to take the active role carried less stigma. This view reveals a world both freer and harsher than ours freer, because desire itself was not erased. Harsher, because intimacy was entangled with power. Yet even in this tangle, love finds its way, for not all bonds are born of dominance. Some are born of quiet equality, 2 souls meeting in laughter beneath smoke-stained rafters. Perhaps you can imagine it now, the men slipping away after the hall has emptied, walking beyond the wooden palisade where frost glitters on the grass, their boots crunching softly as the village dogs stir but do not bark. They speak of journeys, of raids yet to come, of brothers lost to the sea, and their words slow until silence takes over. And in that silence, something unrecorded but undeniable passes between them. Maybe a hand finds another, maybe it does not, but the moment lingers all the same, a moment neither saga nor skald ever dared to shape into verse. And so, As you rest, know this. The Vikings were human, and humanity has always held within it every shape of desire, every form of closeness, even when history tries to flatten it into swords and kings alone. Tonight, we peel back those layers, gently, slowly, until the hall grows quiet again, and the whispers of the past grow loud enough for us to hear. But in the next part of this story, we will step further still, into the laws written by their hands, into the punishments carved, not in poetry, but in judgment, into the tension between freedom and fear, between desire and reputation. Close your eyes now, and let the faint crackle of fire guide you into that deeper chamber of history, where silence was both a cage and a sanctuary dot by the time midday returned to the Viking settlement. Life moved back into its rhythm, as if the feasts and secrets of the night before had been folded neatly away beneath the tasks of daily survival. Women spun wool in the courtyards, children chased each other between drying racks of fish, and men sharpened blades or repaired the hulls of ships that leaned like sleeping beasts against the shore. The longhouse, now aired out with smoke, drifting lazily through the open vents, smelled of pine tar, ash, and the faint sweetness of mead that clung stubbornly to the benches. But beneath these ordinary scenes lay another layer of Viking life. The rules, laws, and social codes that tried, though not always successfully, to shape desire into something controllable. It is here that we find one of the strangest paradoxes in Viking history. On the one hand, their gods themselves blurred lines of gender and power, with Odin accused in poems of practicing seer, a kind of magic considered unmanly, and Loki, transforming freely into animals and even mothering a child. On the other hand, mortal men were bound by laws that sought to punish any suspicion of softness or passivity, for to be branded Argr was not just an insult, but sometimes a legal accusation. The medieval Icelandic law code known as Grágás tells us that to call a man Argr was so serious an insult that it could provoke a duel to the death. Yet, at the same time, the very existence of the law proves such accusations were common. Why? Would lawmakers go to such lengths if these bonds of desire were not part of the fabric of daily life? Picture a trial in a small Icelandic wing, the outdoor assembly where disputes were settled. Men standing in a circle on windswept grass, the accused glaring at his accuser, both with hands on their sword hilts. The crowd hushed. To accuse another, man of being Urgi, was to risk your life. Yet it was also to admit that such relationships were possible, visible, and perhaps feared. And fear often masks fascination. Imagine, too, how complicated survival could be for young men away on voyages. In the belly of a longship, where 30 men rowed in cramped space, their sweat mingling, their songs rising to keep rhythm, how could intimacy not arise? Perhaps it was laughed off as camaraderie, perhaps it was scorned, but perhaps it was also quietly cherished, stored away like a hidden ember that warmed them when the northern nights grew too long. And in this, we find a curious blend of freedom and repression. Freedom, in that Viking men touched, embraced, and lived closer to one another than later centuries of Christian rule would allow. Repression, in that they lived under the constant shadow of insult and suspicion, where their deepest tenderness could be wielded as a weapon against their honor. Yet humor, too, flickers here, for the sagas sometimes describe men calling one another Mare's bride, or henwife, in jest, teasing names that sting, but also reveal the very patterns they claim to despise. Can you see them now, seated around a smoky fire? One warrior teasing another with a sly grin, the group bursting into laughter, while the accused throws back an equally sharp retort, the tension dissolving into ale and song. Even within danger, there was play, and in play, truth sometimes found its chance to surface. But beyond humor came darker realities, for if suspicion hardened into certainty, punishments could be brutal. Some sources suggest men accused of being unmanly could be outlawed, stripped of protection, their names smeared across the community. In harsher tales, whispers of death by drowning or stoning echo faintly, though evidence remains debated, as if the past itself wishes to keep these stories blurred. Yet through this darkness shines a deeper curiosity. Why, if such desires were scorned, do they appear again and again in the very texts meant to erase them? Could it be that the scribes, whether Christian monks or Norse poets, could not help but write down what they saw, even as they tried to mask it as insult? And so the contradictions pile like stones on a fjord shore, heavy yet revealing. For us, listening now, it becomes clear Viking society was neither fully accepting nor fully condemning, but rather caught in that eternal human struggle between the freedom of desire and the fear of judgment. And as you drift deeper into this story, as the firelight of that imagined hall warms your eyelids into heaviness, remember this: silence is never emptiness. It is full of echoes, the echoes of men who loved one another in ways too complex for laws to bind, too tender for insults to erase. And in the next part, we will leave the laws and courts behind and step into the hidden rituals, the quiet bargains made in forests and fields, the subtle gestures that carried more weight than swords. Close your eyes, if they have not already, and hear the rustle of pine above you, the crackle of embers, and the sound of a story moving forward into places history tried to leave in the dark. Beyond the weight of law and insult, there existed another world in Viking life, quieter and less often recorded, where the rituals of intimacy unfolded not in courtrooms or sagas, but in the everyday gestures of survival and belonging. And it is there, in that silence, that the richest traces of unspoken love can be found. Imagine for a moment a wide meadow outside the palisade of a settlement, the grass silvered with dew beneath the long twilight of a northern summer, the air full of the smell of wildflowers, and smoke drifting from distant hearths, and two men walking slowly together at the edge of the trees. They speak not of laws or battles now, but of dreams of journeys yet to come, of fears that linger after raids, of the exhaustion that no ale can soothe. Perhaps their hands brush, perhaps they do not, but the very space between them hums with something unrecorded yet undeniable. For in the Viking world, ritual was woven into everything. The way food was shared, the way oaths were sworn, the way friendships were sealed with gifts or blood. And within these rituals lay room for something deeper, something softer, even if unnamed. Archaeologists have uncovered amulets, rings, and carved tokens that seem to have been exchanged not only between men and women, but sometimes between men themselves, as if a promise had been made, a vow spoken in the secrecy of night. The sagas rarely tell us who slept beside whom in the long winters, but the architecture of the longhouse does. Benches packed tight, furs shared, warmth borrowed from another's breath. Can we not imagine that sometimes, within those hushed spaces, bonds grew that transcended mere necessity? A smile that lingered, a gaze that softened, a promise whispered into darkness. Even the animals of their myths seemed to tell the story. Wolves who hunted in pairs, swans who chose lifelong companions, ravens who always traveled together, Odin's very eyes in the sky. Were these not reminders that companionship was sacred, no matter its form? And yet, within the same halls, laughter could turn sharp if suspicion rose. A jest about Argr slipping from a comrade's lips, cutting as quick as steel. But humor, even biting, reveals presence. It tells us such things were happening. Otherwise the joke would be meaningless. Picture two men at the edge of a feast, one daring to tease, the other rolling his eyes but smiling all the same. The group erupting in laughter that both masked and revealed what no one wished to say aloud. This dance between secrecy and openness is perhaps the most Viking thing of all. For these were people who lived at the edge of extremes between ice and fire, between honor and outlawry, between gods who blurred boundaries and men who tried to hold them firm. And within that tension, desire threaded itself quietly, weaving through rituals of gift-giving, through the touch of arms clasped in oath, through the sharing of cloaks on cold nights. There are whispers of blood brotherhoods sealed not, just with cuts across palms, but with promises that lasted lifetimes, vows so intimate that later Christians called them suspicious, too close to be merely friendly. Perhaps some of these brotherhoods were exactly what the sagas claimed alliances for survival. But perhaps others carried something more, a devotion deeper than politics, a closeness thicker than blood. And if you close your eyes now, you might see it. Two figures leaning against the trunk of a birch tree, their swords laid aside, the world asleep around them, speaking softly into one another's ears, the night sky heavy with stars, the northern lights stirring faint green above the horizon. Such a scene was never written down, and yet it feels more real than the endless battles recited in the poems, because it is here that humanity lies, in the unrecorded moments, the quiet rituals, the secret gestures of love. And as we drift with them into that meadow, into that long night that could belong to any century, know this: what was hidden was not destroyed, and what was forbidden was not erased. Desire always finds its way, even through silence, even through fear, even through history's refusal to admit it. And in the next part, we will move beyond rituals of secrecy into the strange world of Viking magic and myth, where the gods themselves blurred lines of gender and desire, and where mortal men look to those myths for both warning and permission. Let your eyes grow heavy now, and imagine the glow of the aurora shifting over the fjord, as if even the heavens whispered of a truth too, vast to be buried, that the wind over the fjord carried with it not only the salt of the sea, but the whispers of gods. For in the Viking world, myth and life were never separate, and to understand the secret stories of love between men, one must look at the figures they worshipped, feared, and imitated, for the myths themselves were full of blurred lines and shifting forms. Among them stood Odin, the All-Father, the one-eyed wanderer who gave up his sight for wisdom, a god of war and poetry, but also of Syr, the strange sorcery that wove fate itself. Syr was considered a feminine magic, an art of weaving destiny and bending reality, and men who practiced it were often ridiculed as unmanly. Yet Odin himself was said to have mastered it. Think of that paradox. The most powerful of gods accused by his own worshippers of crossing the boundary into softness, mocked in poems for what mortals feared to admit in themselves, and yet still worshipped, still supreme. If the king of the gods could carry such contradictions, might not his people have done the same? And then there was Loki, the trickster, whose stories are laced with transformations that defy every category. Loki shifts from man to woman, from father to mother, from trickster to victim. Once, disguised as a Mare, he was mounted by a stallion, and gave birth to Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse that became Odin's steed. Imagine the sagas told by firelight, the laughter of children as these tales were recited, yet beneath the laughter something else stirred, an awareness that even the gods themselves did not remain confined to one role, one body, one form of desire. If Odin and Loki could cross boundaries without ceasing to be divine, why then should mortal men be condemned for their own crossings in the dark? Here is the strange truth. The very myths that Vikings loved gave permission, even if society punished. Perhaps this contradiction was the heart of it all: public condemnation, private enactment. Sagas of ridicule, lives of intimacy. Syr itself was often performed in secret, in the deep of night, with chanting, drumming, and weaving of symbols. Women were expected to lead it, but men sometimes joined, though they risked being called Argr. Imagine such a ceremony in the dim glow of torches, cloaks wrapped tight against the cold, a circle drawn in the earth, chants rising into the night as flames licked the sky. In that sacred space, roles dissolved, identities blurred, and perhaps a man who in the daylight swung his axe with fury allowed himself to soften, to feel, to touch, to cross into places forbidden by law but allowed by gods. Such rituals carried risk, but they also carried freedom, for magic was always a place of liminality, and liminality has always been the home of Forbidden's love. The gods themselves whispered it through their actions. Thor once disguised himself as a bride to steal. Back his hammer, Loki laughed in the corner, and the giants were fooled by the illusion. In that laughter lay an old truth that boundaries could be mocked, played with, crossed, and sometimes cherished. And perhaps mortal men carried these tales, not only as entertainment, but as quiet justification. You may imagine a warrior, teased, in the longhouse for his closeness to another, throwing back with a grin. If Odin practiced seer, do you call him less of a god? Less of a god? The hall would roar with laughter, the insult deflected, yet beneath it lay a defense stronger than steel. The gods themselves broke rules, and still they ruled. And if you think of it now, you may notice how strangely human that is, how deeply. It reflects our own world, where people condemn what they themselves secretly long for, where the stories we tell become both cage and key. Picture the aurora stretching across the night sky, green and violet curtains shifting like silk, and beneath them two men slipping away from the noise of the hall, their steps crunching frost, their voices low. They speak not only of raids and oaths, but of the gods, of how Loki once bore a child, of how Thor wore a bridal veil, and in their laughter lies recognition that if even gods could cross boundaries, perhaps so could they. And so, myth became mirror, and mirror became permission. A space where love survived despite law. And as you breathe deeper now, resting in the quiet rhythm of this unfolding, know that in the next part we will wander further into the songs and poetry of the Skalds, where words themselves became veils and revelations, where desire hid in, metaphors of ships and storms, and where even silence carried music. Let your eyes grow heavier as the gods fade into the distance, their stories still burning in the smoke of the fire, leading us gently into the verses where mortals dared to speak what their hearts could not shout aloud. If myths gave the Vikings permission to blur boundaries, and poetry gave them the language to disguise what could not be spoken outright, and it is in the verses of the Skalds that we glimpse another hidden layer of desire woven not in blunt declarations, but in riddles, kennings, and songs that carried truths behind masks. Imagine a smoky hall late at night, the benches lined with weary men, and a skald rising to recite a new verse, his voice echoing against carved beams, the listeners leaning forward with their horns of mead. His words are not plain. They never are. Instead, he speaks of ships that long for their harbors, of falcons bound to one another in the sky, of storms calmed only by the meeting of two winds. To most, these are clever metaphors, puzzles to be admired and applauded, but to some, they are something more, a hidden song of longing, a verse of affection clothed in metaphor. In Skaldic poetry, love between men could not be shouted, but it could be hinted, slipped into imagery so layered that only those listening closely might feel its true resonance. Consider the structure of a kenning, those poetic phrases that replace a simple word with something intricate like calling the sea a whale road, or blood a battle sweat. If such imagery could transform the ordinary into something mythic, could it not also turn Forbidden's love into something disguised yet present? There are fragments of verses where warriors are described as more beautiful than women, where friendships are praised with language dripping with intimacy, where loyalty is painted with strokes that go beyond duty. These were not confessions, but neither were they denials. They were songs that held truths like embers, glowing but never fully flaring. Imagine two men listening, one catching the hidden note in the skald's verse, their eyes meeting across. The hall for a heartbeat, the words serving as cover for what could never be spoken. Even insults carried poetry, for to call a man Argr was not done crudely, but often in verse. And though meant to wound, the very rhyme kept the subject alive, proof that such bonds were visible enough to inspire fear. Humor lived here as well, for sagas sometimes tell of men mocking each other in rhyme, their verses clever and biting, the hall erupting in laughter. But laughter does not erase presence. It acknowledges it, even as it pretends to condemn. And here, too, lies the darker side, for words could bind and words could destroy. A verse whispered at the wrong moment could ruin a man's honor, drive him into outlawry, or provoke a duel. Yet still the words were spoken, still the verses flowed, because silence was impossible. Desire always demanded its song, even if sung through riddles. Think of the lonely winter nights when a man might recite a verse under his breath, not to entertain the hall, but to soothe his own heart, shaping his longing into rhythm so it would not break him. Perhaps he compared his comrade to the brightness of a sword or the steadfastness of a mountain, metaphors that sounded like praise but carried deeper heat. Even now, as we listen across centuries, we can hear those echoes muffled, disguised, but unmistakably human. And if you close your eyes, you can picture him, a skald seated by the fire, his face half-shadowed, his words circling the hall like smoke, reaching the ears of one man who understood, who smiled faintly, knowing the song was for him. In this way, poetry became sanctuary, a place where hidden truths could breathe. And it reminds us of something vital, that even when laws forbade and insults threatened, and silence pressed like iron, people found ways to speak, to sing, to remember. A Viking world was not one of absolute silence, but of disguised voices, and those voices have carried, faint but steady, into our ears tonight. As you rest deeper, let the rhythm of those old verses lull you, and know that in the next part, we will step beyond words into the world of voyages, of ships and seas, of endless nights on water, where closeness was not metaphor, but necessity, and where the bonds of men were tested not in poems, but in storms. Out on the sea, the Viking soul was laid bare, for it was on the long voyages that bonds between men were tested, deepened, and sometimes transformed into something unspoken, yet undeniable. And to imagine it properly, you must first hear the creak of the oars as they bite into water, the snap of the sail as the wind fills it, the endless hiss of waves licking the sides of the ship. 30, sometimes more, men pressed shoulder to shoulder on a narrow vessel, their knees almost touching, their bodies moving in rhythm, their voices rising in chant to keep time with the oars. There was no privacy, no corner of solitude, and in that closeness desire found both its greatest risk and its greatest refuge. Picture the nights when the sea stretched black and infinite, the stars mirrored perfectly on the surface, so that it felt as though the ship sailed through a sky turned upside down, and the men huddled under cloaks of sheepskin and wool, breath misting in the cold air. To survive such nights, warmth was shared, sometimes 2 or 3 pressed together, and within that closeness, the line between necessity and intimacy blurred. Did hands ever linger too long? Did eyes ever search the shadows for recognition? The sagas are silent, but silence is not absence. It is the space where the imagination must fill what history refused to keep. Even practical tasks carried strange intimacy. Rowing side by side until muscles ached, eating from the same pot of stew, sharing the same drinking horn, or rubbing animal fat into cracked skin and scarred knuckles to keep them from splitting in the salt wind. These were not luxuries, but survival. Yet survival often gives birth to tenderness. And then there were the storms, when thunder rolled like the voice of Thor himself, when waves lifted the ship high before dropping it into valleys of black water, when every man thought his life might end that night. In those moments, prayer spilled from their lips, but not always to Odin or Thor, sometimes to the man seated beside them, words of loyalty, of promise. If I die, remember me. Imagine one leaning close, shouting over the roar of wind, if the gods take me, let them not take the thought of you. A vow carried on salt spray, lost to the sea, but burned into memory. Humor played its role too. Even here, men teased one another about snoring like bears or spilling stew on their cloaks, and laughter cut the terror of the sea like a blade through rope. But beneath the jest lay trust, and trust is the soil where love grows. One can almost see the knowing smile exchanged between two men who had weathered storms side by side, who had pulled each other from water when the ship lurched too far, who had stood together on foreign shores when axes clashed. Did they name it love? Perhaps not. But love does not need a name to exist. Archaeological finds give us hints carvings of ships where figures stand paired, graves where small objects exchanged on voyages are buried with care, suggesting the bonds formed at sea were more than brotherhood. And in myth, too, the sea was a place of transformation. Jurg, god of the sea and winds, married a goddess of the mountains, but lived always in longing, caught between two worlds. Perhaps Viking men felt the same torn between what their society demanded and what their hearts desired, between the shore of duty and the horizon of longing. As you rest now, imagine lying on the deck of that ship, the stars blazing above, the sea whispering below, the body of another man pressed beside yours, the scent of salt and smoke in your nose, and in that closeness, feel the truth that cannot be erased, that in the endless night of the northern sea, bonds were forged that went beyond blood, beyond friendship, beyond what history dared to write. And in the next part of this story, we will follow them onto foreign shores, into the raids and settlements where secrecy became even more dangerous, and where intimacy had to hide not only from comrades, but from conquered peoples and new laws that sought to shape the heart into something it was never meant to be. When the longships finally touched the shores of foreign lands, the world of intimacy that had been carved in the rhythm of oars and the whispers beneath cloaks entered a more perilous stage, for on raids and settlements, desire had to move with greater caution. Hidden beneath the iron weight of conquest and survival, yet still it breathed, quietly, stubbornly, like embers that refused to die out. Imagine the moment when boots first struck the wet sand of an Irish bay or the rocky coast of northern France. The roar of warriors echoing, shields raised, axes gleaming. And yet within that chaos, two men exchanged a glance that carried something far beyond battle. A reminder that loyalty on the field was bound not only by oath, but by affection too deep to speak aloud. Raids demanded ferocity, demanded that men become more beast than human. And in that transformation, tenderness seemed impossible. But it was there, in the stolen moments after the fire had died down, in the quiet tents where men patched one another's wounds, in the silence of dawn after villages were sacked, and the only sound was the dripping of rain on canvas. It was in those moments that one might reach out a hand to clean blood from a comrade's face, to bind a wound with strips of cloth, the touch lingering longer than it should, the closeness carrying more than duty. The sagas tell us of kings and jarls rewarding loyalty with gifts of gold and silver, but rarely do they admit the softer gifts exchanged in shadow. A carved bone charm slipped into a hand, a braid of hair hidden beneath armor, a quiet kiss pressed to a brow before sleep, overtook them. Even in settlement, when Vikings built homes in foreign lands, the risks were greater still, for now they lived among conquered peoples, among monks who whispered of sin, among laws that grew harsher as Christianity spread across Europe. In Icelandic law, accusations of unmanliness were grounds for legal action. But in Christian lands, the word sodomy began to take root, a charge that carried both spiritual damnation and worldly punishment. And so, what had once been veiled in insult and jest now risked the fire of church judgment. Yet still men found ways. Picture them in the quiet fields of York, where Norsemen settled among Saxons. Two warriors who had once crossed the sea together, now tending flocks side by side, speaking in a mixture of tongues, their closeness unnoticed by most, but deeply felt between them. Or imagine the bustling markets of Dublin, where Viking traders met beneath timber roofs, selling amber and walrus ivory, their eyes scanning the crowd until they found the one face they sought, the face that turned a world of noise into silence. Humor lingered here too, for men mocked each other about being too fond of one another, even as they shared houses, their jests both cover and confession. And in darker places, danger followed, for to be caught in such intimacy could mean ruin, not only in law, but in the eyes of comrades who might turn loyalty into betrayal if shame demanded it. Yet still, desire threaded through it all, quiet, as moss creeping over stone, unkillable, unseen, yet everywhere. Archaeology offers its faint clues: paired burials in places of settlement, small trinkets exchanged between men, even church records that complain of Viking men being unnatural in their affections. These complaints, ironically, confirm the truth. They saw what was happening, even if they condemned it. And so, the story of Viking intimacy on foreign shores is one of paradox. Fierceness in war, tenderness in aftermath, loyalty in public, love in private, condemnation in law, survival in secrecy. And if you let your eyes close now, you may see it yourself. The fire crackling low after a raid, the bodies of comrades sprawled in exhausted sleep, and two men lying, awake, listening to each other breathe, knowing that if tomorrow brings death, at least tonight they are not alone. In the next part, we will move from raids and settlements to the deeper household lives of the Norse, to the farms and hearths where families gathered, and where hidden affections found ways to survive under the weight of duty, marriage, and the endless turning of the seasons. When the fires of raids dimmed and the sails of longships were folded away, Viking life did not end on the battlefield or the open sea. It returned to the stead, the farmstead where families lived, where smoke curled steadily from turf-roofed houses, and where the rhythm of daily survival shaped every hour. It is here, among the creak of barns, the lowing of cattle, and the spinning of wool, that another layer of intimacy unfolded, one hidden beneath the ordinary demands of marriage, kinship, and duty. For most Viking men, a wife was expected, children were a necessity, and alliances were sealed not only with swords, but with marriages that bound families together. Yet within these structures of duty, the quiet longings of the heart could not always be silenced. Imagine the layout of a Viking longhouse. One great room where families, servants, and animals shared the same space, where benches lined the walls, where furs were spread for sleep, where the glow of a central hearth cast flickering light on the horn. Beams blackened with soot. Privacy was nearly non-existent, and yet secrecy thrived, for secrecy does not require walls, only glances, gestures, and silences that mean more than words. Picture two men working side by side on a farm splitting. Wood, repairing a fence, herding animals down to the river. Their tasks were ordinary, unremarkable, but their laughter when one slipped in the mud, or their quiet sharing of bread beneath a tree, carried something deeper than labor. Perhaps one lingered when handing over a tool, fingers brushing just a little too long. Perhaps one's eyes followed the other as he walked away, the look hidden from everyone else, but known within himself. Even within marriage, such affections could live, for history has always known that duty and desire do not always walk the same road. There are sagas that speak of women mocking their husbands for being too close to another man, Words thrown in quarrel that reveal what no one wanted to say outright. And yet those accusations also reveal truth that others saw, noticed, perhaps even understood, even if they clothed it in ridicule. Imagine the feast of a wedding, when families gathered in a longhouse heavy with the smell of roasted meat. Laughter loud, songs rising, and yet somewhere in the crowd, two men caught each other's gaze, knowing that the bond between them would outlast the ritual of the day. Perhaps one gave the groom a gift more personal than any other, a carved piece of amber or a knife with a handle polished smooth from his own hand. And perhaps the meaning of that gift was lost on others, but clear to them. Archaeology has uncovered such tokens, small objects buried with care, exchanged with devotion, their significance unspoken but enduring. Humor, too, slips into these domestic spaces, for men teased one another about spending too much time in each other's company. Women joked about who cooked better or who milked cows more quickly, laughter echoing against the wooden beams. Beneath the jest, however, lay a recognition that closeness existed, even if unspoken. And yet shadows lingered, for in these households Christianity began to spread, carried by missionaries and priests, whispering new laws of sin and punishment. Where once the insult of Argr was enough, now eternal damnation was threatened, and so secrecy grew thicker, silence heavier. But silence is not absence. Love and longing continued, hidden beneath the creak of looms and the shuffle of feet on dirt floors, hidden in the way two men chose to tend the sheep together, or always seemed to be the ones sent hunting in pairs. If you close your eyes now, you can see it, the glow of the hearth on weary faces, the sound of wind pressing against turf walls, and in the midst of that ordinary life, two men sitting quietly on a bench, shoulders nearly touching, speaking softly so no one else can hear. It is in these small scenes that history becomes human, for desire never waits for permission. It exists where it will. And as the seasons turned, as winters pressed long and harsh, as summers filled the fields with light, these hidden bonds endured, fragile yet fierce. Tonight, as you drift further into rest, know that in the next part, we will move deeper still into the rituals of oath-making and brotherhood, where blood and blade sealed bonds that may have carried meanings far beyond politics, and where intimacy was not only lived in secret, but sanctified in ritual. Among the many rituals that gave shape to Viking life, none carried more weight than the making of oaths. For in a world where honor was currency and betrayal could mean death, to swear loyalty was to bind one's soul, and sometimes those bonds ran deeper than the sagas dared to explain. Picture two men standing in a clearing at dusk, the air sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth, the sky painted in hues of violet and gold as the sun sinks behind the mountains. They extend their hands, palms cut lightly so that blood rises, and clasp them together, their lifeblood mingling as witnesses look on. This was the ritual of Fosberg Ralligsworn Brotherhood, foster brotherhood, a vow so sacred it carried the weight of family, stronger sometimes than blood kinship itself. The sagas tell us of these pairs, men who swore never to be apart, who pledged to die together, who were buried side by side when death finally came dot to most historians. These oaths were political, alliances forged for survival, but the intimacy of their language stirs questions that cannot easily be silenced. One saga describes foster brothers lying together in bed, their loyalty so complete that they could not sleep apart. Another recounts men vowing never to marry unless their brother did, binding their futures together as tightly as their present. Is this only loyalty, or does it carry the hidden pulse of love? The line is blurred, as it always is when the heart hides beneath ritual. Imagine the firelight flickering across their clasped hands, the hush of the forest around them, the whispers of witnesses fading into silence as the two men stare into each other's eyes, knowing that this oath will define the rest of their lives. Their bond is sealed with words, but also with touch, with the mingling of blood that feels as intimate as any kiss. And in this ritual, we glimpse the strange contradiction of Viking society, that it condemned softness in insult, yet sanctified, closeness in ceremony, that it mocked desire in jest, yet honored devotion in ritual. Humor sometimes flickered here too, for in sagas men teased one another about choosing their foster brother over a wife, their laughter half joke, half truth. One can almost hear the hall erupting as a warrior boasts, "I need no bride, for my brother fills my cup," the laughter covering what no one would name aloud. Yet beneath the jest lies an echo of something deeper, and it is in that echo that we find the humanity history so often hides. Archaeology once again whispers faintly. Graves where two men lie side by side, not as kin, but as companions. Artifacts exchanged between them, tokens that meant more than status. And in myth, too, the pattern repeats gods who swore oaths. Of brotherhood, gods who lay beside one another in loyalty that hints at something unspoken. Even darker stories hint at the peril of such bonds, for the sagas also tell of brothers betrayed, of vows broken, of the agony of loss when one fell in battle and the other was left alone. His grief described in words that sound more like a lover's lament than a warrior's. Perhaps this is the truest sign of their depth, not the laughter, not the ritual, but the grief that followed when the bond was severed. Imagine a man kneeling on a battlefield, blood soaking the ground, his sworn brother dying in his arms, whispering a last promise with his final breath. The sagas record such scenes as loyalty, but if you listen closely, the rhythm of grief beats differently. It is raw, tender, uncontainable. And if grief is the measure of love, then love was surely there, even if never named. Tonight, as you lie in stillness, let yourself picture those clasped hands, those vows spoken beneath the northern sky, and know that intimacy has always been sanctified in ways history refused to acknowledge. In the next part, we will step from the oaths of foster brothers into the battlefield itself, into the strange ways that desire and death entwined, and how intimacy whispered even among the clash of shields and the thunder of steel. On the battlefield, where shields clashed like thunder, and the air was thick with the copper tongue of blood, intimacy among Viking men was tested in ways that defied both law and laughter. For war strips away the masks of daily life and reveals the truths that silence cannot hold forever. Picture a wide meadow outside an Irish monastery, mist rising from the ground as dawn breaks, the longships pulled ashore and warriors forming a shield wall, their voices rising in a chant to summon courage. To outsiders, they are one body, one machine of violence, but within that wall, each man knows who stands beside him, whose shield locks with his own, whose shoulder presses steady against his in the chaos of the fight. And often, that shoulder belongs to someone whose presence means more than survival, someone whose life is tied to his own not only by oath, but by unspoken affection. Imagine the battle erupting, the clang of steel on steel, the cries of pain, and triumph, the rush of fear that seizes even the bravest hearts. In that chaos, men glanced to their right and left, and in those fleeting looks, there was more than strategy. There was devotion, a silent plea. Don't fall, stay alive, stay with me. The sagas celebrate loyalty, but they do not dwell on the trembling in a man's hands as he watched his sworn brother stagger, nor do they record the way grief tore through him when the body he cherished was struck down. Yet in the fragments of those stories, we hear the echoes. Warriors who refused to leave the field when their brother fell, who stood until cut down themselves rather than flee. Men whose grief poured into verses that sound far closer to love, songs than war chants. One saga tells of a warrior weeping openly over the body of his fallen comrade, mocked by others for his tears, yet refusing to hide them. Tears in Viking culture were not forbidden. Grief was part of honor, but the depth of that grief sometimes revealed bonds too strong to be dismissed as mere comradeship. Humor, strangely, found its place even here. Men joked about who ran faster into battle, who held their shield steadier, who tripped over their own feet in the mud, laughter cutting briefly through terror. And yet beneath the jokes was the unspoken truth that each life was bound to another. That laughter was a fragile shield against the knowledge that death could come at any moment. Archaeology gives us its quiet testimony. Graves where two warriors are buried together, weapons laid neatly, sometimes with objects that suggest companionship rather than mere kinship, small tokens that had no battlefield value but every emotional one. Were they brothers by blood? Sometimes, perhaps, but not always. And when they were not, what then? Might we be looking at pairs of men who chose to be united in death because they had been united in life in ways the sagas dared not write? The gods themselves spoke to this in myth, for even in tales of Ragnarok, where the world ends in flame, there are verses that linger on the bonds between warriors, the way they fought not for victory, but for each other, the way loyalty became the only form of immortality left. Imagine the battlefield after the clash is done, smoke rising from burned huts, the cries of the wounded drifting into the sky, and one man crawling to the side of another, lifting his head gently, pressing his own forehead against his, whispering words the scribes never recorded. Perhaps he said, "I will see you in Valhalla." Perhaps he said nothing at all, for sometimes silence speaks louder than any vow. If you close your eyes now, you may feel that silence, heavy and eternal, stretching from the battlefield into your own breath. And yet, even in this darkness, love was not destroyed. It lived in grief, in memory, in the refusal to let death erase devotion. And so, the battlefield became not only a place of loss, but of revelation, a space where bonds that dared not be spoken in life were shouted in death through tears, sacrifice, and unshakable presence. Tonight, as the story deepens, know that, in the next part, we will step away from the field of blood and into the halls of memory, where songs and sagas try to reshape these truths into tales of honor, even as the hidden pulse of love throbbed beneath every line, when the clamor of battle faded and the dead were carried from the fields. What remained was memory, and in Viking culture, memory was never private. It was shaped into story, into song, into saga, so that the living could carry the weight of the fallen. But memory is a strange thing. It remembers not only what is said, but also what is left unsaid. And in the verses of the Skalds, in the whispered tales told by firelight, we find echoes of bonds too deep to be called simply friendship. Imagine a hall after battle, benches, filled with warriors nursing wounds, the smell of smoke and sweat thick in the air, the fire crackling low. A skald stands and begins to weave words into verse, praising the courage of the dead, exalting the loyalty of those who survived. His words are shaped in kennings, those layered phrases that turn blood into sword sweat and battlefields into corpse meadows. Yet between these metaphors slip softer images. The warrior who was the sun to his brother's sky, the man who clung to another as a ship clings to its harbor. To the hall, these are clever turns of phrase. To those who listen closely, they are something more veiled confessions of love. For poetry was the only safe place to speak what the law forbade, the only way a skald could hint at desire without naming it. Some verses that survive describe men in terms of beauty usually reserved for women, their hair compared to gold, their eyes to the brightness of stars. Were these exaggerations for praise, or were they subtle gestures of admiration carried deeper than loyalty? We cannot know, but the possibility lingers like the glow of embers. Humor found its way even here, for warriors teased each other about the skald's verses. one nudging another with a grin. He praises you more sweetly than your wife ever could. The hall would laugh, mugs would bang against tables, yet beneath the joke lay acknowledgement. Words reveal what eyes cannot hide, and sometimes grief poured too raw to disguise. There are laments recorded where one warrior mourns another with words so aching they read more like love poems than elegies. One verse cries, "My heart is broken as a ship without sail, for he who steadied me is gone." These are not the detached words of politics. They are the cries of a soul undone. Archaeology, again, gives faint confirmation. Carved runes where men's names are paired together, ships etched side by side as though to say, "We belonged." In some graves, poetry itself was scratched onto wood or stone, fragments that survived where flesh did not, lines of remembrance that carried bonds beyond death. Imagine hearing such verses recited in the dim light of a hall, the listeners nodding solemnly, their minds perhaps drifting to their own companions, their own unspoken truths. For memory is contagious. It stirs what others try to bury. And so, the sagas became double-edged. They celebrated loyalty while hiding longing. They exalted brotherhood while erasing love. They recorded grief but never admitted its depth. Yet what they could not destroy was presence. For every time a skald compared one man to the sun in another sky, he kept the truth alive, even if hidden in metaphor. Tonight, as you breathe slowly, imagine those halls filled with verse, the smoke curling into rafters blackened by time, the words rising and falling like waves on the sea, carrying with them fragments of intimacy disguised as loyalty. In the next part, we will leave the halls of poetry and step into the quieter world of burial and ritual, where the dead were laid to rest, not only with swords and shields, but sometimes with tokens of affection that tell us what the sagas would not. If songs kept memory alive in smoky halls, then burials wrote it into the earth. And to follow the hidden story of love between Viking men, we must walk softly among their graves, across low mounds rimmed with stones, along shorelines where ship outlines linger like ribs in the grass, and into quiet clearings where wind moves through birch and pine as if still reciting the names of the dead. Imagine dawn mist beating on heather, dew turning every spiderweb into a silver net, and a procession moving slowly, voices low, cloaks pulled tight not only against the chill, but against the ache that comes when a life is gone. And within that procession 2 men walk side by side, one alive and one soon to be laid down, and the living one carries a small thing curled in his palm, a token no one else sees, a smooth bead of amber, a whalebone charm, a sliver of antler carved with, a mark only they knew. Burials among Norse folk were not all alike. Some burned upon pyres so fierce that bone turned to pearl-gray ash. Some set in boats on water, or in boats drawn up on land and roofed with turf. Some placed in timber coffins under mounds, where offerings lay like sentences completed. But across these variations, a quiet thread runs. The dead were given what they loved, what they needed, what they were. Swords for warriors, keys for wives who ruled the household stores, scales for traders, tools for smiths, gaming pieces for those who knew how to pass long winters with laughter. And sometimes, when you look carefully, there are pairings that do not fit the neat stories later ages prefer. 2 men lying close in a shared mound, grave goods arranged not as rivals, but as complements, as if 2 halves of a single life. Archaeologists argue about such findings. Of course, they are trained to be cautious, and caution is a good candle in the fog. But even caution cannot erase the way certain burials feel. The way 2 swords are laid, like parallel lines of verse. The way a brooch or a ring sits between where 2 hands might have met. The way a small carved token shows signs of long handling, rubbed smooth by thumb and worry and love. Picture a ship-shaped grave cut into sandy soil above a fjord, stones marking the keel and prow, the outline filled with dark earth, and the faint perfume of pine shavings on which the dead are set like travelers ready to depart. The village has gathered old men with walking staves, women with faces that have weathered more winters than the men's swords have, children made solemn by the strange dignity of it all, and the skald murmurs a few lines, not lofty enough to be called a poem, just the steady rope of words that keeps the community from drifting. He was brave, someone says. He was loyal, says another. But the living man who stands at the foot of the grave does not speak, because to say what is true would be to break something in the air, to let spill a tenderness no one is ready to hear. Instead, as the first shovelful of earth is thrown, he steps forward and drops his small amber bead, the one he has carried through storms and winters, into the hollow between the dead man's hands. A gesture so small it could be missed, and yet it weighs more than a sword. Sometimes graves hold curious pairings needle cases beside axe heads, combs near spear points, gaming pieces where you would expect a whetstone and the scholars propose. Sensible explanations, status, trade, gifts, inheritance, and sometimes they are right. Often they are right. But every now and then, an arrangement reads not like inventory, but like a love letter written in objects. His favorite comb, because he always joked about the salt tangling his hair. His game pieces, because winter nights were their time. A strip of cloth dyed with precious matter, folded and tucked like a secret blush. Cremation complicates things further, for flame devours detail and leaves only the grammar of arrangement. Urns set with care, ash mingled, charcoal and bead and bone. There are urns where two people's remains appear together, and though arguments circle, kinship, plague, battle, the simplest truth is this: to be placed together after death means someone living believed you belong together. In some places, ship burials gleam with richer things, silver arm rings, scales, balance weights, Arab coins that came north by trade, and at the edge of splendor sits some small human piece, a wooden tally, a knotted thong, a splinter of carved bone. The living tuck these away as if to say, when you wake in the other hall, you will know me by this. And there is a kind of gentle humor even at graveside's old comrades nudging each other. He never let me win at Taffel. May the gods finally teach him mercy, a lightness that keeps the grief from drowning them. But after the chatter fades and the mound is sealed, night returns different, as if the ground now hums with a new chord. And not all rites were so mild. There were send-offs where the community demanded spectacle, drums and chanting, horse, trappings rattling, a shore crowded with faces lit by fire. And though later writers embroidered these scenes to scandalize or convert, one can still sense the core. A people who believe death is a voyage and love a kind of cargo. What is a token if not ballast to keep a soul from capsizing? And then there are the stones, the runic markers where letters stride like tall men across granite. You run your fingers along them and sometimes find simple speech. So-and-so raised this in memory of so-and-so. His friend, and friend, is a wide word. Friend is a tent with room for weather and warmth alike, and the wideness itself is a clue. On a hill above a river, a low mound bears two names. A carver did not say brothers, did not say kin, merely set the names like paired oars, each stroke answering the other. Another stone notes, he was the best of companions, and you feel a throat tighten across 1,000 years. Of course, not every pair is a pair in the way we mean love has many shapes. Loyalty has many doors, but under the turf of certain mounds the air feels warmer, as if the earth itself remembers a closeness lived in whispers. Sometimes a burial yields odd-gendered echoes that trouble neat categories ornaments that later ages called feminine in the grave of one who wielded weapons, tools of war and weaving side by side, and though scholars debate identity and role and right, for our quiet purpose here, the point is simpler. The Vikings lived within a spectrum of being that their myths admitted freely, and their laws tried to herd. And burial reveals both currents at once, the admission and the herding, the freedom tucked inside form. Stand now at the lip of a newly heaped mound, and listen to the sounds that follow funerals anywhere: boots scuffing soil, low talk, someone coughing to scatter tears, a child asking a frank question and being shushed. Then listen beneath that to the words not said. I loved him. I would have followed him farther. I do not know how to be, now that he is gone. These are the same in any age. The living man lingers until only ravens remain, their black wings cutting neat seams in the air, and when at last he turns away, the path down the hill seems longer, as if time has stretched, as if the world has grown one room larger and one room emptier. The seasons will wheel, the mound will fur over with grass, then snow will give it a soft shoulder, then spring will stitch it with violets, and people will learn to pass by it without stopping, as people do, but at odd hours. Someone will still pause, lay a palm to the ground, and feel heat where logic says there should be none. And in far settlements, where Norsemen put down roots among foreign customs timber churches rising, bells telling a new story about sin and order graves shift in shape and prayer. Yet a few stubborn gestures survive the change. A tiny token. Hidden in a shroud, 2 names on 1 stone. Ash mingled without explanation. The old ways learning new disguises like Skaldic verse did. Even the placement of mounds could speak a pair set so their shadows touched at noon. A line of small cairns, pointing toward the mouth of a fjord, as if to guide a traveler home little cartographies of grief. We think of burial as an end, and in a way it is. But in these hushed landscapes, burial is also a text. And if you read with patience, the letters form sentences that are less about power than about presence, less about kings than about those who held each other's gaze too long at feasts. You may smile at the thought of stern men fretting over grave gifts, the way a lover frets over ribbon. Shall we place the comb? No, the gaming piece. He hated losing to me gentle humor that breathes through centuries, because love is forever fussing, arranging, smoothing corners. And when night drapes the mounds and the tide lifts its slow breath, you could almost imagine the ship-shaped graves stirring, not to sail away, but to rock ever so slightly, the way a sleeper adjusts in dreams when a familiar hand touches his shoulder. There is a darkness to this too. Burials that speak of punishment, stones toppled, markers scraped, gossip carried into law so that the dead are denied the resting signs the living wish to give them. A broken circle of stones where a ring should be whole. But even in erasure, trace remains, and trace is enough to tell us this much. Desire persisted, and people tried to honor it where they could. As you breathe more slowly now, feel the ground under your imagined feet, the soil cool and damp, the grass catching moonlight. And know that our next step in this journey will lead us from earth, back to living rooms of wood and wool, to the weaving of households under the soft pressure of a new faith, to the quiet reshaping of intimacy as priests arrived with different calendars and different words for the same human ache. Next, we will slip into those border years when old rites and new rules overlapped like 2 voices singing in a round, and watch how love careful, stubborn, inventive found fresh ways to survive when the age of burial mounds and pagan rites began to bend beneath the weight of a new faith. Viking households entered a twilight of overlapping customs where the old gods still whisper in carved wood, while priests, bells tolled from timber churches rising on the edges of fjords. And it was within this tension that hidden desires faced both new dangers and new disguises. Imagine a village at dusk in the 10th century, smoke coiling from longhouses as it had for generations, the air smelling of peat and salted fish, the laughter of children mingling with the chanting of a missionary. Not far away, his voice carried, on wind that smelled faintly of pine and sea. Inside the hall, little had changed. The hearth still glowed. The benches were crowded. Families and servants shared the same close warmth. But outside, law and faith began to shift, and intimacy, that had once been hidden behind insults like Argr, now faced the sharper edges of sin and damnation. Where once a jarl might laugh off a jest about two men being too close, now whispers grew heavier, because priests framed it not only as shame, but as eternal peril. And yet desire does not vanish at the sound of a bell. Picture two men tasked with tending sheep in the uplands, their cloaks drawn close against the chill, their voices drifting as they trade stories of raids past and winter survived. To the world, they are simply comrades. But when their laughter fades and silence stretches, one looks longer than he should. One hand brushes another, and the weight of both pagan and Christian judgment hovers around them. And still, the moment happens. The sagas hint at these new tensions. Women accusing husbands of being unmanly with sharper edges now. Christian scribes layering their own condemnations onto tales that once spoke only of honor and insult. Yet the contradictions never fully resolve. The same society that mocked men for softness still praised the depth of male bonds in verse, still sanctified brotherhood in oaths, still buried companions together as if love could not be erased by law. Humor survived even in this harsher world. Men teased one another about going too often to church with a certain companion, or about spending more time in the pastures together than with wives, the laughter serving as both mask and admission. Archaeological clues from this border era show tokens still exchanged: small rings, carved bone amulets, now tucked more carefully into graves, hidden beneath layers of Christian rite, but not abandoned. And in the longhouses, where space was tight and nights were long, secrecy deepened, for intimacy needed new disguises. A pair of foster brothers sharing not only chores but glances, traders who traveled together to markets in York or Dublin, lingering longer than business required, warriors who slipped from feasts to walk the edge of the fjord where only the stars could see them. Imagine such a walk beneath the northern lights, the aurora shimmering green and violet like a veil above the black water, the sound of bells faint on the wind from a distant chapel, and two figures pausing, torn between the fear of damnation, preached by strangers, and the truth of the warmth they felt in each other's nearness. Did they think the gods judged them? Did they fear the Christ would condemn them? Or did they, like so many before and after, simply take the moment and hold it, knowing that love does not wait for permission? If you close your eyes now, you might hear their footsteps crunching frost, feel the cold biting your cheek, sense the stolen warmth of shoulders touching beneath a single cloak. And in this overlap of faiths, we see humanity's stubbornness. Even as laws grew harsher, intimacy found ways to survive, to hide in plain sight, to weave itself into ordinary life, as if to prove that no creed could strip it away entirely. Tonight, as your breath slows and your body grows heavier with rest, let this scene settle over you. The hall glowing with firelight, the church bell echoing faintly outside, and two men sitting close, the world shifting around them, but their bond unbroken. And in the next part, we will step deeper into these Christian centuries, where law codes grew stricter, where silence thickened, but where beneath that silence, desire learned to speak in new, more secret languages, songs, carvings, gestures, so small they could pass unseen, yet powerful enough to keep the truth alive. As Christianity tightened its hold across the Norse world, the silence around same-sex desire thickened, turning from teasing jests in the hall to accusations sharpened by sin. And yet even here, in the dim corners of turf-roofed homes and along the lonely tracks that wound through pine forests, affection did not die. It adapted, shrinking itself into gestures so small they could slip unnoticed between the heavy stones of new law. Imagine a settlement in Iceland in the 11th century. The longhouse still thrums with the same rhythm as before, firelight flickering across benches, children chasing each other among hanging cloaks, the air alive with the smell of roasting lamb and wool drying by the hearth. Yet now a small timber church rises on the hill above, its bell marking hours that once belonged only to the sun and moon, its priest preaching in a tongue borrowed from abroad, warning against sins once unnamed in these valleys. In this world, intimacy among men became both more dangerous and more precious, for to be caught meant not only insult, but damnation in the eyes of the new faith. And still bonds formed. Picture two men sitting side by side during a sermon, their knees touching beneath woolen cloaks, each pretending to gaze at the cross, but aware of the other's breath. Or think of them returning from tending sheep, trudging side by side through snow, their laughter carried on cold wind, their closeness disguised as necessity. Desire began to hide itself in crafts, as well tiny carvings tucked into the beams of houses, runes scratched faintly on wood that could be passed off as ornament, verses sung softly while working, metaphors that to most sounded harmless, but to one listener burned with secret meaning. Archaeologists have uncovered crosses etched with runes that seem personal, names paired together like threads, too subtle for priests to erase. Were these prayers, or were they quiet confessions clothed in holy shapes? Humor persisted, stubborn. As ever, for the Norse never abandoned their love of teasing. Men joked about who lingered too long in another's company at market, or who carved more charms for one friend than for his wife, the laughter covering what could not be accused openly. Yet beneath the jest, as always, was truth. Darkness shadowed these years as well. Records from Christian law codes speak of punishments harsher than exile threats of burning, drowning, the stripping of honor so complete that a man could not even inherit land. And yet if such laws were written, it is because such loves existed, too common to ignore, too persistent to crush. Imagine the fear that lived in one man's chest as he looked across the hall at another, knowing that to speak aloud what his heart felt was to risk not only his name, but his soul. And imagine also the courage it took to still sit close, to still share work, to still carry tokens of affection in secret. At night, when the priest's words had faded into the hum of insects and the rush of the river, men slipped into fields under moonlight, their cloaks pulled tight, their footsteps muffled on grass, speaking softly of things they dared not voice by day. Did the stars above judge them? Or did they, remembering Odin's shapeshifting, Loki's transformations, Thor's bridal disguise, find reassurance in the old stories that the new faith tried to silence? If you close your eyes now, you may see them. Two figures crouched by. A riverbank, the water glinting silver, their hands meeting briefly in the dark, the touch electric, fleeting, enough to carry them through another day of silence. And so, intimacy learned to survive in these narrow spaces, trading open laughter for hidden smiles, trading public vows for secret gestures, trading sagas for whispers carved in wood. Tonight, as your breath slows and the weight of sleep begins, to settle, hold this image. A world reshaped by new faith, but hearts refusing to be remade, finding ways to keep their truth alive. And in the next part, we will move further into these centuries, exploring how trade, travel, and the mingling of cultures gave Viking men glimpses of other worlds where boundaries shifted, and how those glimpses fed the quiet fire of longing. Even in the shadow of the cross, trade and travel were the lifeblood of the Viking world, and with every voyage across rivers and seas came not only silver, silk, and stories, but glimpses of lives lived differently, glimpses that stirred longing and perhaps gave secret permission to men whose desires were already alive in silence. Imagine a Viking ship slipping up the Seine, the oars dipping in rhythm as mist rose from the riverbanks. Monks in stone cloisters watching nervously from a distance, while markets in the town below bustled with traders from Francia, from the Mediterranean, from lands further still. Here, Norsemen encountered cultures that carried their own laws, their own sins, their own secrets, and in that exchange, new ideas about desire traveled as quietly as the coins and beads that passed from hand to hand. In Constantinople, where the Varangian guard stood tall in glittering halls, Viking men found themselves in a world saturated with splendor, domes dripping with gold mosaics, streets alive with perfumes and spices, eunuchs guiding court rituals, with grace that blurred the edges of masculine and feminine. Did the guards from the north, standing in their wolfskin cloaks, feel something stir as they watched men dressed in silks move through palaces with poise that their sagas would have mocked? Some surely laughed, calling them soft, but laughter can hide fascination. In Arab lands, too, Norse traders encountered poetry far more explicit than their own, verses that spoke openly of male beauty, of longing between men, of passion set to rhythm beneath desert stars. Imagine a Viking hearing such lines sung aloud, his mind racing with recognition, with wonder at a world where what he held only in silence was carved proudly into verse. Back home, perhaps he repeated those lines quietly to a companion, disguising them as foreign curiosity, but feeling their truth in his own chest. Archaeology tells us of Arab coins found in graves from Sweden to Iceland, silver dirhams carried north along river routes. Each coin is a fragment of trade, but also a reminder that ideas travel with objects, that longing can be nourished by knowing it exists elsewhere. Humor traveled too, for men returned from abroad mocking the silk wearers and perfumed courtiers, their jests sharp but edged with envy, for what is envy but desire wearing laughter as armor? And darker truths linger as well. Some cultures punished desire even more harshly, and travelers returned with stories of men executed for their love. Tales meant to frighten, to warn, but stories also plant seeds, and seeds grow even in stony ground. Imagine two Varangians standing watch at the palace gates, their axes gleaming in torchlight, whispering to each other about the things they had seen inside the dances, the poems, the closeness of men that no saga would admit. And in that whisper they found not only astonishment, but recognition, that they were not alone, that the thing between them was not some aberration, but part of a wide, hidden river flowing across cultures and centuries. Picture now a Norse trader returning to his village, his pouch heavy with coins, his heart heavy with memories of distant ports, seeking out the man who had always waited for him, telling him stories of palaces and poems, while leaving out the part that mattered most, that in every foreign city he felt the same pulse, the same unspoken fire, and that fire led him back home, back to this bench, back to the quiet closeness that was worth more than all the silver he carried. And if you close your eyes now, you may see it, two men seated by a fjord, the stars mirrored in still water, one recounting distant markets, the other listening with a smile, their hands almost meeting, the silence between them filled with the weight of everything not said. Travel widened their world, but it also deepened their silence, for they knew now more clearly what was forbidden, and yet also knew more surely that they were not alone. And so, trade and travel gave them both temptation and consolation, proof that their desire was part of something greater than their fjord, something carried on the same winds that filled their sails. Tonight, as the tide of sleep rises, let that image stay with you. A ship rocking gently at its mooring, foreign coins clinking in a pouch, and two men seated in its shadow, their closeness speaking louder than any story. And in the next part, we will step into the twilight of the Viking world itself, when raids softened into kingdoms, when Christianity hardened its grip, and when the stories of hidden love passed into memory, still breathing beneath the new order, Goddess. The Viking Age entered its twilight, and the world they had shaped through fire and ore began to soften into kingdoms of stone and parchment. The story of hidden desire among men shifted once more, no longer lived in the roar of raids or the freedom of long voyages, but in the quieter shadows of farms, towns, and courts now bound more tightly by Christian law. And yet, even in this new order, the pulse of forbidden intimacy refused to vanish. Imagine a village in the late 11th century, its longhouse still standing sturdy against the wind, but beside it rises a church whose bell tolls in Latin rhythm, and where once men swore oaths beneath the open sky, they now kneel before carved crosses, their hearts weighed with the same love, but cloaked in heavier silence. Raids across Europe dwindled. The great ships pulled up on beaches to rot into skeletons, while Viking chieftains styled themselves kings, their power now measured, not in pillage, but in alliances sealed with Christian marriage, and treaties signed with bishops' ink. In such halls, intimacy between men could not parade, even in jest it retreated further, into looks stolen across feast tables, into verses whispered rather than sung, into tokens hidden beneath layers of duty. Yet traces remain. Chronicles, written by monks in the north, grumble about unnatural attachments among warriors, complaints that accidentally preserve what they tried to erase. Archaeological finds from this period show fewer pagan burials, but more churchyards. And still, now and then, graves hint at closeness. Two men interred side by side, no kinship recorded, their bones resting together beneath carved crosses, as if secrecy followed them even into the earth. And in the sagas written down in these centuries, the tone shifts, where once insult and jest carried the memory of same-sex bonds. Now Christian scribes stiffen the language, painting such closeness as shameful, yet the very effort to erase betrays persistence. Imagine a feast in a converted hall, the fire still crackling, but prayers offered before drinking horns are raised. A skald stands to recite, but his verse is clipped, cautious, his metaphors dulled by fear of sin. Yet even here, a clever turn of phrase slips through, a comparison of one warrior's beauty to sunlight on snow, and one listener smiles faintly, knowing the song carries more than it admits. Humor did not die, though it became sharper-edged. Men still teased about who spent too much time tending another's farm, but laughter now ended with the sign of the cross, as if to cover what the heart had already spoken. Darker truths lay in law code's punishments, written not only in exile, but in death, sermons promising damnation. But history teaches us this: the harsher the silence, the stronger the persistence beneath it. Desire does not yield to decree. It bends, hides, adapts. Picture two men walking home from a church service, their cloaks pulled tight against winter wind, the snow crunching beneath their boots, their words cautious, but their steps in rhythm. When they reach the edge of the village, one lingers, brushing snow from the other's shoulder, with a gesture so quick it could be mistaken for nothing, but for them, it is everything. These were the twilight years of the Viking spirit, when axes gave way to plows, when ships gave way to chapels, when sagas turned to scripture, and yet beneath all of it, the same hidden fire endured. And if you close your eyes now, you can hear it, the echo of bells mingling with the faint crackle of hearth fires, the whisper of old gods still flickering in the corners of memory, the quiet breath of men who sat close despite the weight of God's silence pressing down upon them. Tonight, as you sink deeper into rest, hold this image: a world in transition, faiths colliding, ships rotting, kingdoms rising, but love quiet, stubborn, enduring, finding ways to survive. And so, as the sails of the Viking age slipped below the horizon and their longships rotted into memory, what remains is not only the clang of swords and the roar of conquest, but the softer truths that history tried to bury, truths that live in glances and whispers, in carved stones and shared graves, in verses disguised as praise, and tokens tucked into the earth. If you walk among their ruins now, the moss-covered stones of halls, the outlines of ships in burial mounds, the runes half-faded on granite, you may not hear the names of kings or jarls, but you may feel something subtler, a hum in the soil, that remembers the love men carried for one another in silence, a love never sanctioned, yet never erased. For beneath the noise of sagas and sermons lies the same current that flows through every age, the longing to be seen, to be held, to know that one's breath matters to another. The Vikings lived fiercely, but they also lived tenderly, and though law and faith tried to push tenderness into shadows, the shadows did not destroy it. They preserved it, carried it forward, so that even now we can sense it in the quiet corners of their world. Imagine a longhouse at night. The fire burned low, the hall silent, and two figures seated shoulder to shoulder, saying little, simply listening to the wind press against the wooden walls. Or imagine a ship rocking gently at anchor, the stars, mirrored in black water, and two men wrapped in the same cloak, their breath mingling in the cold. These moments were not carved into stone, but they were real as any battle, as enduring as any kingdom. And perhaps that is the true lesson of their hidden history, that love does not need permission to exist, that it will find its way even where silence reigns, that it leaves traces for those who know how to listen. Tonight, as your eyes close and your body drifts deeper into rest, carry this with you. You are not only hearing about the past, you are feeling its heartbeat, a reminder that across centuries and seas, humanity is bound not only by war and glory, but by the quiet persistence of love. Perhaps your dreams will take you to a fjord where ships rest under northern lights, or to a hall where embers glow and voices fade. And there, in the hush between worlds, you will find them still, their laughter, their loyalty, their longing waiting, to remind you that what is hidden is never lost. Sleep now, softly, as the story closes, and let the silence cradle you, just as it once cradled their secret truths.